Historians will remember Venezuela's decision and they won't be kind. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not the date of a battlefield victory, not the signing of a landmark treaty, but the day Nicolas Maduro declared himself the winner of Venezuela's presidential election. On the surface, it was just another rigged vote in a country that has perfected the art of electoral theater. The official results gave Maduro 51% of the vote, his opponent Edmundo Gonzalez 44%, and the rest scattered among minor candidates. The Carter Center, which had monitored past elections, wasn't even allowed in this time. The U.S. State Department called the results fraudulent. The EU expressed serious concerns. Even some of Maduro's usual allies in Latin America, like Brazil and Colombia, hesitated before offering tepid congratulations. But here's the historians won't remember this election for the fraud. They'll remember it for what came next, for the decision Maduro made in the days that followed, a decision that will ripple through the 21st century in ways most people still don't grasp. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of Latin American politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of U.S. hegemony. I've watched as Washington's foreign policy establishment, time and again, misreads the signals, overplays its hand, and then wonders why the world keeps slipping through its fingers. Venezuela's latest move is no exception. What's unfolding right now isn't just about oil, or democracy, or even Maduro's survival. It's about the end of an era and the birth of something far more dangerous. Let me tell you what's really happening. The official what they want you to believe. The story the Biden administration wants you to accept is Venezuela is a failed state, a narco-dictatorship propped up by Russia and China, and its people are desperate for change. The election was stolen, the opposition was crushed, and now the U.S. must lead the free world in condemning Maduro's regime while offering support to the legitimate democratic forces inside Venezuela. The numbers seem to back this up. Venezuela's economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation once hit 1 million%. More than 7 million people, nearly a quarter of the population, have fled the country. The U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions, including a ban on Venezuelan oil exports, which once accounted for 95% of the country's revenue. The White House has repeatedly warned that Maduro's government is a threat to regional stability, pointing to his alliances with Iran, Russia, and China as proof of his malign influence. The media has largely echoed this framing. CNN and the New York Times have run stories about the brave opposition fighting against a brutal regime. Pundits on MSNBC and Fox News alike have called for stronger action, with some even suggesting that the U.S. should recognize Gonzalez as the legitimate president and consider all options to remove Maduro. The narrative is clean, moral, and most importantly, simple. Good versus evil. Democracy versus dictatorship. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete. It's actively misleading. Deconstructing the what's really happening in Venezuela. Let's start with the election itself. Yes, Maduro's government has a long history of electoral manipulation, ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, disqualifying opposition candidates. But here's the part they're not telling: the opposition also cheated. Not on the same scale, but enough to muddy the waters. Exit polls conducted by independent firms showed Gonzalez winning by a landslide, some as high as 60-30. But the opposition's own internal data, leaked to the press, suggested a much narrower margin, closer to 52-48. Why the discrepancy? Because the opposition, fearing a repeat of 2018, this time ran a candidate who was not their first choice. Maria Corina Machado, the fiery opposition leader who won the primary with 92% of the vote, was barred from running by the Maduro-controlled Supreme Court. So they settled for Gonzalez, a little-known diplomat with no political base. The result? A fragmented opposition, a confused electorate, and an election where both sides had reason to claim victory. Now, let's talk about the sanctions. The U.S. has framed them as a tool to pressure Maduro into holding free and fair elections. But here's the inconvenience: sanctions don't work. They never have. Look at Cuba, Iran, North Korea. Decades of economic strangulation, and the regimes are still standing. In Venezuela, the sanctions have done two: they've impoverished the population, and they've pushed Maduro deeper into the arms of America's adversaries. Before the US imposed its oil embargo in 2019, Venezuela was selling 500,000 barrels a day to American refineries. Today, that oil goes to China and India, often at a steep discount. The Chinese pay in yuan, not dollars, which helps Beijing chip away at the dollar's dominance in global trade. The Russians, meanwhile, have stepped in with military advisors, intelligence support, and even a few hundred Wagner Group mercenaries. Iran has sent drones, cybersecurity experts, and even a few Revolutionary Guard officers to help Maduro's regime survive. The sanctions didn't weaken Maduro, they strengthened his alliances with America's enemies. And then there's the real reason the US cares about oil. Not just any oil, the oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. For decades, American companies like Chevron and ExxonMobil dominated Venezuela's energy sector. But when Hugo Chavez nationalized the industry in the 2000s, those companies were kicked out. The US has been trying to get back in ever since. The sanctions were supposed to force Maduro to the negotiating table, where he would agree to new elections and, eventually, a return of Western oil companies. But Maduro isn't playing that game anymore. Here's where it gets interesting. In the weeks leading up to the election, there were secret negotiations between the US and Venezuela. The Biden administration offered to ease some sanctions in exchange for a free and fair vote. Maduro agreed, then immediately backtracked when he realized he couldn't win without cheating. But the real kicker? The US knew he was going to cheat. They had intelligence reports, opposition sources, even signals intercepts all pointing to a rigged election. So why did they go along with it? Because the alternative was worse. If the US had walked away from the negotiations, Maduro would have had no incentive to hold an election at all. And without an election, there would be no pretext for the opposition to rally around. The Biden administration needed the appearance of a democratic process, even if it was a sham, because it gave them cover to escalate later. They were setting the stage for something bigger. And now, they've got it. The geopolitical how Venezuela became the next proxy war. Let's out for a moment. The world is in the middle of a great power competition unlike anything we've seen since the Cold War. The US is trying to maintain its dominance in a multipolar world where China is rising, Russia is resurgent, and the global south is increasingly assertive. Latin America, long treated as America's backyard, is now a battleground for influence. Venezuela is the perfect storm. It's got oil, gold, and rare earth minerals. It's a gateway to the Caribbean, a staging ground for drug trafficking, and a potential military foothold for Russia and China. And most importantly, it's a test case for whether the US can still enforce its will in its own hemisphere. The Russians see Venezuela as a way to bleed the US in its own neighborhood. Every dollar Washington spends on sanctions, every hour of diplomatic bandwidth devoted to Venezuela, is a dollar and an hour not spent on Ukraine. The Chinese see it as a way to lock in long-term energy supplies and extend their Belt and Road Initiative into Latin America. And the Iranians? They see it as a chance to stick it to the great Satan by helping a regime that hates America as much as they do. But here's the part that should keep you up: none of these powers want a direct confrontation with the US. They're not stupid. They know that if they push too hard, they'll trigger a response that could spiral out of control. So instead, they're playing a game of plausible deniability. Russia sends military advisors. China buys oil at a discount. Iran provides drones and cyber tools. None of it is enough to provoke a full-scale US invasion, but it's enough to keep Maduro in power and to keep the US off balance. Now, let's talk about the US response. The Biden administration has three options, none of them. 1. Do nothing. Recognize Maduro's victory, ease sanctions, and hope that engagement will moderate his behavior. This is the realist approach, but it's politically toxic. The Republicans would crucify Biden for surrendering to a dictator, and the Venezuelan opposition would feel betrayed. 2. Double down on sanctions. Cut off Venezuela's remaining oil exports, freeze its assets abroad, and push for a full economic blockade. This is the moral approach, but it's also the most dangerous. It would trigger a humanitarian catastrophe, drive Maduro even closer to Russia and China, and risk turning Venezuela into a failed state that exports instability across the region. 3. Escalate covertly. Support the opposition with money, weapons, and intelligence. Recognize Gonzales as the legitimate president. Maybe even authorize a limited military intervention, say, airstrikes on key regime targets or a naval blockade. This is the hawk approach, and it's the one that's gaining traction in Washington. Here's the all three options are terrible. And the reason they're terrible is because the US has spent the last 20 years overestimating its ability to shape events in Latin America. The military way this could get ugly fast. Let's talk about the elephant in the military intervention. I've heard the arguments. Venezuela is weak. Its military is corrupt. A few airstrikes, a little support for the opposition, and Maduro will fall. That's what they said about Iraq. That's what they said about Libya. That's what they said about Afghanistan. Venezuela is not Iraq. It's not Libya. It's not even Cuba. It's a country with a battle-hardened military, a population that has endured years of economic warfare, and allies who are more than willing to help it fight back. The Venezuelan military is not the Iraqi army of 2003. It's a force that has been trained by Russia and Iran, equipped with advanced air defense systems, and hardened by years of counterinsurgency operations. The Russians have supplied S-300 missile systems, which can shoot down U.S. aircraft. The Iranians have provided drones and cyber capabilities that could disrupt American communications. And the Chinese? They've helped Venezuela build a network of underground bunkers and command centers designed to survive a U.S. attack. Now, let's say the U.S. does launch airstrikes. What happens next? Maduro declares a state of emergency. The military cracks down on the opposition. Russia and China veto any UN Security Council resolution condemning the strikes. Iran sends more advisors. And suddenly, the US is bogged down in another endless conflict, this time in its own backyard. But here's the real Maduro doesn't even need to win a conventional war. All he needs to do is survive. Because the moment US troops set foot in Venezuela, the narrative shifts. Suddenly, it's not about democracy versus dictatorship. It's about Yankee imperialism. And in Latin America, that's a narrative that sells. I've been warning about this for years. The US has a habit of underestimating its adversaries and overestimating its own power. In Vietnam, we thought we could bomb North Vietnam into submission. In Iraq, we thought we could shock and awe Saddam into surrender. In Afghanistan, we thought we could build a democracy in a country that had never had one. And now, in Venezuela, we're making the same mistake. The hawks in Washington will tell you that a quick, decisive strike will solve the problem. But war is never quick, and it's never decisive. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and it has a way of spiraling out of control. The domestic political why Biden can't afford to back down. Now, let's talk about the politics. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about Florida. The 2024 election is shaping up to be a nail-biter. Biden is trailing Trump in the polls, and the margins in key swing states are razor-thin. Florida, with its 30 electoral votes, is a must-win for both candidates. And Florida has a huge Venezuelan American population, nearly 300,000 people, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are fiercely anti-communist. The Biden administration knows that if it looks weak on Venezuela, it will lose Florida. And if it loses Florida, it loses the election. That's why you're seeing a shift in tone from the White House. In the days after the election, Biden's team was cautious, calling for calm and dialogue. But now, they're talking about consequences. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has hinted at further measures. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has met with opposition leaders. And behind the Republicans, of course, are pushing for even tougher action. Marco Rubio, the senior senator from Florida, has called for the U.S. to recognize Gonzales as the legitimate president and to use all tools at our disposal to remove Maduro. Trump, never one to miss an opportunity to attack Biden, has accused the administration of appeasing dictators. So here's the Biden can't afford to look weak on Venezuela, but he also can't afford to get dragged into another war. The American people are war-weary. The economy is shaky. And the last thing Biden needs is another foreign policy crisis on his hands. But here's the thing about foreign: it doesn't care about your domestic politics. The world keeps moving, no matter who's in the White House. And right now, the world is moving in a direction that's very bad for the United States. Scenario: what comes next? Let's game this out. Here are the 3 most likely scenarios, along with my best estimate of their probabilities. Scenario 1: the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the U.S. imposes new sanctions, recognizes Gonzales as the legitimate president, and provides covert support to the opposition. Maduro digs in, cracks down on dissent, and relies on Russia and China to keep his regime afloat. The result is a frozen conflict, no war, but no resolution either. Venezuela remains a failed state, a haven for drug traffickers, and a thorn in the side of U.S. policy in Latin America. This is the least bad option, but it's still terrible. It means years of instability, more refugees, and a slow-motion collapse that drags down the entire region. Scenario 2: the proxy war. This is the scenario I think is most likely. The U.S. ramps up support for the opposition, providing weapons, training, and intelligence. Maduro responds by deepening his ties with Russia and Iran. The Russians send more military advisors. The Iranians provide drones and cyber tools. The Chinese keep buying oil. And suddenly, Venezuela becomes the next Syria, a proxy war where the U.S. and its adversaries fight through local allies, with no clear path to victory. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because proxy wars have a way of escalating. One miscalculation, one stray missile, one cyber attack that goes too far, and suddenly, you're looking at a direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. Scenario 3: the full-scale intervention. This is the nightmare scenario. The U.S. launches airstrikes, imposes a naval blockade, and maybe even sends in ground troops. Maduro declares a state of emergency. The military fractures, with some units defecting to the opposition and others staying loyal to the regime. Russia and Iran ramp up their support. And suddenly, the U.S. is bogged down in a quagmire that makes Iraq look like a cakewalk. I give this scenario a 10% probability, but that's still too high for comfort. Because once you start down this road, it's very hard to turn back. The grand strategy why the U.S. keeps losing. Let's take a step back and ask the big why does the U.S. keep getting this wrong? The answer, I think, lies in the fundamental flaw of American the belief that the U.S. can and should shape the world in its own image. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that America's security and prosperity depend on spreading democracy, free markets, and human rights around the globe. This was the logic behind the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the interventions in Libya and Syria. It's the logic behind the sanctions on Venezuela, the pressure on Cuba, the efforts to contain China and Russia. But here's the it doesn't work. The world is not a blank slate waiting for American values to be imposed. It's a complex, messy, often brutal place where power matters more than ideals. And the U.S., for all its military and economic might, is no longer the sole superpower it once was. We're living in a multipolar world now. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global south is increasingly assertive. And the U.S. is struggling to adapt. The tragedy of Venezuela is that it's a perfect example of this failure. The U.S. had a chance to engage with Maduro, to offer a path to reintegration in exchange for real reforms. Instead, it chose confrontation. It imposed sanctions that hurt the Venezuelan and people while enriching the regime's inner circle. It doubled down on a strategy of maximum pressure that has, by every measurable metric, failed. And now, with Venezuela's decision to pivot toward Russia and Iran, we're seeing the consequences of that failure play out in real time, not just in Caracas, but across the hemisphere. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about oil or sanctions or even Maduro's survival. It's about the slow-motion collapse of the Monroe Doctrine, and with it, the last vestiges of U.S. hegemony in its own backyard. For 2 centuries, Washington has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence, a region where outside powers, first the British, then the Soviets, now the Chinese and Russians, were to be kept at arm's length. But Venezuela's defiance, and the lack of a coherent U.S. response, is the clearest signal yet that this era is over. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. When Maduro invited Russian troops for joint military exercises in 2023, it wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a direct challenge to the U.S. Southern Command, which has spent the last decade preparing for exactly this: the emergence of a hostile, Russian-backed state in the Western Hemisphere. The exercises included the deployment of Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers, nuclear-capable aircraft that can reach the U.S. mainland in a matter of hours. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, Moscow has a forward operating base in the Americas, and it's not in Havana. It's in Caracas. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. military is not prepared for this. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute danger, but it treated Latin America as an afterthought. The Southern Command's budget has been slashed for years, its forces stretched thin by counter-narcotics missions and disaster relief. Meanwhile, Russia has been methodically extending its presence. Since 2019, Moscow has signed military cooperation agreements with Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia, and its deepening ties with Argentina under Javier Milei's government. Yes, even the libertarian firebrand has courted Russian investment in energy and defense. Iran, too, has been busy. The Quds Force has established a permanent presence in Venezuela, training local militias and helping the regime evade sanctions through oil-for-arms deals. In 2021, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned a network of Iranian and Venezuelan officials involved in a scheme to sell Iranian drones to Caracas, but the transfers continued unabated. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that if the U.S. were to launch a military intervention in Venezuela, whether to secure oil fields, overthrow Maduro, or counter Russian and Iranian influence, it would be fighting a war on 3 fronts. First, against the Venezuelan military, which, despite its decay, still fields Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, T-72 tanks, and a network of coastal missile batteries. Second, against Russian and Iranian advisors embedded with Venezuelan forces, who would almost certainly provide real-time intelligence and electronic warfare support. And third, against the political and economic fallout of a conflict that would send oil prices soaring, destabilize Colombia and Brazil, and hand China a golden opportunity to present itself as the responsible global power. Let's talk about the S-300s for a moment, because they're a perfect example of how Venezuela's pivot has changed the military calculus. These are not some relic from the Cold War. They're advanced, mobile surface-to-air missile systems that can track and engage multiple targets at ranges of up to 200 kilometers. In 2019, when the U.S. was considering airstrikes to support Juan Guaidó, the Pentagon ran war games that assumed the Venezuelan air defenses could be neutralized within 72 hours. But that was before Russia upgraded the systems with new radar and electronic countermeasures. Today, those same war games suggest that a U.S. air campaign would lose at least a dozen aircraft in the first week, with casualties in the hundreds. And that's without factoring in Russian or Iranian intervention. Now, you might be: the U.S. has faced worse. We took on the Soviet Union in Cuba, we fought proxy wars in Central America, we toppled Noriega in AMA. But those were different eras. In the 1980s, the U.S. could count on regional allies like Colombia and Argentina to provide basing and logistical support. Today, Colombia is led by Gustavo Petro, a leftist who has called for an end to U.S. military presence in the country. Argentina, despite Milei's pro-U.S. rhetoric, is too economically fragile to risk alienating Russia or China. Brazil, under Lula, has made it clear that it will not support any U.S. military action in Venezuela. That leaves the U.S. with only one reliable partner in the Guyana. And while Georgetown has been a steadfast ally, it's a country of 800,000 people with an army of 3,000. Hardly a staging ground for a major intervention. The military constraints are bad enough, but the geopolitical constraints are worse. The U.S. is already stretched thin by its commitments in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Every dollar spent in Venezuela is a dollar not spent countering China in the South China Sea or supporting Ukraine against Russia. And let's not forget the domestic political reality. The American public has no appetite for another war, especially one that could spiral into a direct confrontation with Russia or Iran. In 2020, a Gallup poll found that only 22% of Americans supported military action to remove Maduro. That number hasn't gone up. If anything, it's gone down. So where does that leave us? With a policy of containment that is neither containing nor a policy. The US has imposed sanctions, but they've failed to topple Maduro. It has supported the opposition, but Guaido is now a footnote in history. It has conducted military exercises with regional partners, but those partners are increasingly reluctant to play alone. And all the while, Russia and Iran are digging in, turning Venezuela into a forward operating base for their own ambitions in the hemisphere. Here's what I think is going to happen. The US will continue to muddle through, imposing targeted sanctions, supporting opposition figures, and hoping that Maduro's regime collapses under its own weight. But that's not a strategy. That's wishful thinking. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran will keep extending their influence, using Venezuela as a hub for arms sales, energy deals, and intelligence operations. China will continue to buy Venezuelan oil at a discount, further undermining US sanctions. And the Monroe Doctrine will to history, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The real tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. In 2015, when Maduro was still consolidating power, the US had an opportunity to engage with the regime, to offer a path to sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms. Instead, it chose confrontation, betting that the Venezuelan people would rise up and overthrow Maduro. That bet failed. And now, the US is left with either accept a Russian and Iranian client state in its backyard, or risk a war it cannot win. I don't envy the policymakers who have to make that call. But I do know historians will remember Venezuela's decision not just as a failure of US policy, but as a turning point in the global balance of power. The era of American unipolarity is over. The question now is what comes in. The uncomfortable truth is that Venezuela's descent into authoritarianism and geopolitical irrelevance wasn't just a failure of US policy, it was a failure of imagination. The establishment in Washington still clings to the idea that the world operates on either you're with us or against us. But Venezuela has exposed the hollowness of that framework. Maduro didn't just survive, he thrived in the cracks of American indifference, Russian opportunism, and Chinese pragmatism. And now, the domestic political dimensions of this crisis are revealing something even more: the Venezuelan people are no longer the primary actors in their own story. Let me explain why this matters. For years, the narrative in Western media and policy circles was that Maduro's regime was a house of cards, propped up only by repression and oil money. The opposition, led by figures like Juan Guaido, was framed as the inevitable future, the democratic alternative that would restore Venezuela to its rightful place in the hemisphere. But that narrative ignored a fundamental in Venezuela: the opposition is as fractured as the regime is resilient. Guaido's rise in 2019 was less a sign of opposition strength and more a symptom of its desperation. He was the right man at the right time, a young, charismatic leader who could unite a coalition of parties, civil society groups, and international backers. But he was never more than a figurehead, a placeholder for a movement that had no real plan beyond ousting Maduro. Now, what most people don't realize is that the opposition's collapse wasn't just about Guaido's personal failings. It was structural. The Venezuelan opposition has been plagued by infighting, corruption scandals, and a fundamental disconnect with the very people it claims to represent. Take the 2020 parliamentary elections, for example. The opposition boycotted them, arguing that the process was rigged. That might have been true, but the boycott also handed Maduro a supermajority in the National Assembly, effectively neutralizing the last institutional check on his power. The opposition's strategy of international pressure and domestic resistance had failed, and in the vacuum, Maduro consolidated control over the judiciary, the electoral council, and the military. Here's where it gets even more complicated. The opposition's fragmentation isn't just a tactical error, it's a reflection of Venezuela's deeper social and economic divisions. The country is no longer the petrostate of the 20th century, where oil wealth could paper over class and regional tensions. Today, Venezuela is a nation of survivors, where 90% of the population lives in poverty, according to the Incovi survey conducted by Andrés Bello Catholic University. The middle class has been hollowed out, the professional class has fled, and the poor are left scrambling for scraps in an economy that has shrunk by 75% since 2013. In this context, the opposition's calls for democracy and human rights ring hollow to a population that is more concerned with putting food on the table than with abstract political ideals. This brings me to the most uncomfortable question of what happens when a population stops believing in the possibility of change. The answer, I think, is that they stop engaging. Voter turnout in Venezuela has plummeted. In the 2020 parliamentary elections, only 31% of eligible voters cast a ballot, down from 74% in 2015. That's not just apathy, it's a silent referendum on the entire political class, opposition, and regime alike. The Venezuelan people have been betrayed by their leaders, abandoned by the international community, and left to fend for themselves in a country that has become a geopolitical chessboard. And in that void, Maduro has done something. He has turned survival into a form of legitimacy. Let me give you an example. In 2021, Maduro launched a series of economic reforms that, on the surface, looked like a desperate attempt to stabilize the economy. He loosened price controls, allowed the use of foreign currency in domestic transactions, and even flirted with privatizing some state-owned enterprises. The results were mixed. Hyperinflation slowed, but poverty deepened. Yet what's fascinating is how these reforms were framed. Maduro didn't sell them as a retreat from socialism, he sold them as a pragmatic response to U.S. sanctions. In other words, he turned economic necessity into a nationalist rallying cry. And it worked. Polls show that while most Venezuelans still disapprove of Maduro, they also believe that the U.S. is more to blame for their suffering than their own government. This is the domestic political reality that Washington refuses to acknowledge. The U.S. still operates under the assumption that if it tightens the screws, more sanctions, more diplomatic isolation, Maduro will eventually crack. But that's not how authoritarian regimes work. They don't collapse under pressure, they adapt. Maduro has survived by doing three. First, he has co-opted the military, ensuring that the generals have a stake in the regime's survival. Second, he has fragmented the opposition, using a mix of repression and co-optation to keep potential rivals off balance. And third, he has diversified Venezuela's international alliances, turning the country into a hub for Russian arms sales, Iranian oil smuggling, and Chinese investment. Now, let's talk about the scenarios that could play out in the coming years. The first, and most likely, is what I call the zombie state scenario. In this version of the future, Venezuela remains a failed state in name but a functional one in practice. Maduro's regime continues to limp along, propped up by a mix of repression, patronage, and foreign support. The economy stabilizes at a low level, with enough oil revenue and remittances from the diaspora to keep the lights on. The opposition remains fragmented, the international community loses interest, and Venezuela becomes a permanent fixture on the list of forgotten crises. This is the scenario that Russia and Iran are betting on. They don't need Venezuela to thrive, they just need it to survive. The second scenario is what I call a controlled transition. In this version, Maduro recognizes that the status quo is unsustainable and cuts a deal with the opposition to hold free and fair elections in exchange for sanctions relief and international recognition. This is the scenario that the Biden administration has been quietly pushing for, and it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Maduro has already shown a willingness to negotiate when it suits him. In 2021, he sat down with the opposition in Mexico City under the auspices of Norway, and while those talks collapsed, they proved that Maduro is not averse to diplomacy. The problem is that any transition would require concessions that Maduro is unlikely to make, like releasing political prisoners, allowing international observers, or even stepping down. And even if he did, the opposition would struggle to govern in a country as broken as Venezuela. The third scenario is the one that keeps me up at the Sudan option. In this version, Venezuela descends into full-blown civil conflict, with the military fracturing along ideological and regional lines. We've already seen glimpses of this. In 2019, a group of dissident soldiers launched a failed coup attempt. In 2020, a former intelligence chief, Hugo El Pollo Carvajal, defected to Spain and accused Maduro of drug trafficking. And in 2021, a former military attaché in Colombia, Cliver Alcala, was extradited to the U.S. on drug charges. These are not isolated incidents, they're signs of a military that is increasingly divided. If Maduro loses control of the armed forces, Venezuela could become a battleground for competing factions, each backed by foreign powers. Russia and Iran would double down on their support for Maduro, while the US and its allies would back the opposition. The result would be a proxy war in the heart of the Western Hemisphere. Here's the none of these scenarios are good. The zombie state scenario condemns Venezuela to decades of stagnation. The controlled transition scenario is a long shot that would require a level of political maturity that neither Maduro nor the opposition has shown. And the Sudan option would be a humanitarian catastrophe. But here's what I think is most a hybrid of the first two. Maduro will continue to rule, but he'll make just enough concessions to keep the international community at bay. He'll allow limited elections, release a few political prisoners, and even invite international observers, just enough to create the illusion of progress. Meanwhile, the opposition will remain divided, the economy will remain in shambles, and the Venezuelan people will continue to suffer. Now, what does this mean for the US? It means that the old playbook, sanctions, isolation, and regime change, is obsolete. The Biden administration has already signaled a shift in approach, engaging with Maduro on issues like oil exports and hostage releases. But this is a tactical adjustment, not a strategic rethink. The US still sees Venezuela through the lens of great power competition, as a battleground in its struggle with Russia and China. That's a mistake. Venezuela is not just a pawn in a geopolitical game, it's a country of 28 million people who deserve better than to be treated as collateral damage in a new Cold War. Here's my final thought. Historians will remember Venezuela's decision not just as a turning point in the global balance of power, but as a cautionary tale about the limits of American influence. The US spent decades trying to shape Latin America in its image, only to watch as the region slipped further into chaos and authoritarianism. Venezuela is the most extreme example of that failure, but it's not the only one. From Nicaragua to Cuba to Bolivia, the US has struggled to adapt to a world where its economic and military dominance is no longer guaranteed. The lesson of Venezuela is that in the 21st century, power is not just about coercion, it's about persuasion, about offering a vision of the future that is more compelling than the one offered by your adversaries. And that's the tragedy of Venezuela. No one, not Maduro, not the opposition, not the US, has offered the Venezuelan people a vision worth fighting for. Instead, they've been left with a choice between a corrupt authoritarian and a fractured opposition, between a collapsing economy and a geopolitical proxy war. In the end, the Venezuelan people will be the ones to pay the price. And historians will remember this not just as a failure of US policy, but as a failure of leadership on all sides.